what was important at a very young age. You know,
The word profound, like some sort of cliche, but it is profound.
their life and don't have any support or are trying. Now, if you can't write the book, but you can write an article and just get it out there.
Welcome to this Sessions from the Edge presentation. I'm Patrick Nolan, the formula for Life Anchor. Before we get started, I'd like to remind you that the definitions, conceptual models, and texts within this content serve exclusively as reflective navigation frameworks. Formula for Life or its guests do not deliver medical advice, diagnostic evaluations, or clinical treatment alternatives. All adjustments to any functional health considerations such as your physical health routines, medical protocols, or daily pharmaceutical intervals must be supervised directly by your human healthcare team. Thank you for your consideration. So let's start decoding, aligning, and thriving beyond survival.
We have a look at their approach to the mind, body, and the soul, because it's not just lip service. What I've found is that the people that I talk to here on the podcast, they've really embodied what it means to embrace mind, body, and soul to overcome some of life's greatest challenges. And my guest today is an incredible person. She's been working for a Fortune 500 company as a marketer. She's in real estate these days and doing very well in that regard. But not only that, she's also had the time to write a book. But that is not why she's here. Today, we're talking to Tracy Mansolillo because of the hardships that she's gone through and what she's done to make a life that's not just decoding. She's aligned it, but now she's thriving. So Tracy, welcome to Sessions from the Edge, and thank you for coming on and being a guest.
Thank you, Paul. It's a pleasure to be here. I'm really happy to have this conversation today and really just shed some light on some of the topics that you talk about all the time, because I think a lot of people don't talk about things that the hard stuff that they've been through. And personally, I know I didn't for probably 2 decades. I kept everything hidden. I was ashamed that I had a chronic illness. I felt responsible in some way, but it was ridiculous that I was too young to see. I didn't have that perspective of this just happened to me. There was nothing I could have done. And so it's taken me many, many years to come around and redesign my life around both my ongoing health condition and just some other issues in my life, and just figure out a way, like you said, to not only just live and survive, but to really thrive. And that's what I try to do every day.
And that's incredible, because what happened to you? I mean, it's a rather unique one in the scheme of things.
Yeah, so I was living my best life. I was in my mid-20s. I had gone to college and got out, had studied business and marketing, got a fantastic job when I got out of school for a large international company, and grew with them for many years, went on to several other companies, really just fell into my dream job, my dream life. I didn't even know what it was looking like until I was in it. And I was traveling and doing work that I loved and working with wonderful people. And one day I woke up and was very, very ill. I didn't know what hit me. I thought it was the flu, like when you wake up and you're feeling like you're getting the flu. But this was in September. It wasn't really a typical flu season. And I ended up being very, very sick for about 2 weeks. I was headed to a business trip in New York. And I had meetings scheduled that had been planned for some time, and I had to cancel. And I'll never forget, at the time, my boss, who was actually younger than I was at the time, didn't believe I was actually ill, and gave me a really hard time for canceling. But I couldn't get off my couch. I had like 103 fever, was just deathly ill. And that 2-week episode continued for quite a bit of time. And I ended up having to take a leave of absence from my job. I saw specialists throughout. I live in New England, saw specialists throughout the area. Nobody knew what was wrong. And they kept telling me it was some virus, it was some infection. We just can't pinpoint it. But I was having severe symptoms. My liver was shutting down, fevers every day, fatigue that I couldn't get my head off the pillow. And I went from this high functioning person who was also training for my first marathon to not being able to get out of bed like that in a blink of an eye. And it derailed my whole life.
Yeah.
I ended up being let go from that job after I had 6 months of personal leave, and they said, you either come back or we got to let you go.
Yeah.
And I was in no position to go back, so I lost my job.
And you still didn't know what it was for quite a while after that. But ultimately, how do you float along like that? You know, going through all those. I mean, it's one thing to be ill and feeling off, but it's another to go through what would have also been quite a psychological trauma, going through, you know, trying to hold your job and all that sort of thing, and you know, the conversations that must have transpired in that process. What was that like?
It was probably the most difficult time of my life, or definitely up until that point in my life, it was the most difficult. I didn't know what hit me, honestly. I thought I had, you know, everything going for me, and then it was all just gone. And there were no answers. And the fact that there were no answers was the most frustrating point, because I couldn't do anything to try to get better because they didn't know what was wrong with me. And my dad was a physician. So I grew up around a lot of physicians. Like, my parents would have entertained a lot, and they'd have their friends over, and my dad had a friend in every specialty, right? So he was calling all of his friends saying, Tracy's really sick. Like, we don't know what else to do. People would recommend different things. And so my dad was really invested in the process with me. And I think that gave me some faith that if anyone is going to figure this out, it's going to be my dad and I together, because he was in the medical profession and he was just as frustrated as I was. I think that if I didn't have his support at that time, I'm not sure I would have gotten over that initial trauma.
I mean, if anybody's going to identify a condition, it'll be a clinician, which would have been hugely frustrating, especially for your father, because he would have been frustrated in himself, not being able to find the source. I imagine. So it would have been hard for the both of you, and then for you to lose your career over it again, for a parent, as you and I both are, that would also be shattering for him, because he would have known that it was related to a chronic condition that you haven't been able to figure out. So that was, how old were you then?
I was 26 then.
And it all came crashing down.
Yeah, it really did. And it made me reevaluate what was important at a very young age. You know, typically people in their 20s are just trying to establish themselves.
So what was important for you at that moment? I mean, you know, you have a sudden crash of career, sudden crash of health, and it's a profound disruption. So it completely shatters your timeline. It completely shatters your identity. How do you move forward from that? How did you reshape yourself?
Baby steps, right? I
Mm.
started, and when I think back now to those early days, I was such, I didn't know anything that I know today, right? We grow, we learn. I've studied with so many coaches, mentors, different people over the years that really clued me in on the mind, body, spirit.
Yeah.
I'd say back 30 years ago, what kept me going, I always had faith. So, some sort of religious faith in something bigger. And I thought, this can't just be how my life is going to be. And there has to be, maybe there's a reason for it. Um, and I just fell back on being grateful for what I did have,
Mm.
which was not a lot, believe it or not, because I lost everything.
Yeah.
But what I had amazing parents that were very supportive. Um, I had a dad who was invested in trying to help me figure this out.
Yeah.
And I had a dog who I loved. And, I'm a big dog person, and I feel like he was my special dog at that time. I said, okay, I got to go back to like the beginning. Like, what am I thankful for today? And it really just started with gratitude. And every day I would wake up and say, I'm just thankful that I have these loving people around me that are willing to help. If I was able to get out of bed and walk outside and see the sun, I was grateful for that. Because when everything is stripped away so quickly, you realize all the things that you've taken for granted.
Yeah, you do, don't you? And
And
it is. I keep saying the word profound, like some sort of cliche, but it is profound. Like there is. I've said this often before to with guests that there's that moment before the chronic illness, and then there's the moment after, and you can't go back.
right.
I said to you before we came on that I've lived two lives: a life before 50, a life after 50. You can't go back once you've been diagnosed with a condition, or once you've been impacted by the condition. So I know how you feel. So let's have a talk about the condition. What is it that you have?
So today I know what I have, but
Mm.
I went more than 2 decades without knowing really what I had. I was misdiagnosed with several other conditions, misdiagnosed and treated for other conditions.
And so what were
Um,
they, and what did they point and prick and
yeah,
prod?
so one of the things was I was misdiagnosed and treated for lupus.
Mm-hmm.
Which is an autoimmune disease.
Mm-hmm.
And I was getting treatment from specialists in Boston, and I was getting sicker and sicker. And I thought, this doesn't seem to really be working. And so eventually, after years, I started to say, I know what my body is trying to tell me. I don't know how to fix it, but I became very in tune. I knew whether I had a fever without taking my temperature. That's
Yeah,
just when
right.
you live in that space for a long time, you just know.
Mm.
And so I got to a point when I kind of swore off the medical community and I said, I'm
Mm.
done. It's been years and no one's really helped me. They really gaslit me for many, many years and told me it was all in my head. And
This
I
is the medical
actually,
profession.
yeah, and I did believe them for a little while. You
Oh, did
can't
you?
help but not.
Oh.
But my dad knew that, there were concrete on black and white test results on paper that weren't right. And he said, we're going to get to the bottom of it. We will. And at some point, but I stopped looking for the answer for many, many years. And I just slowly worked my way back to a point where I was able to work part time and do some consulting work. And again, I was blessed with former colleagues that knew what I had been through and wanted to help me and give me opportunities. So,
Mm.
but it took many years before I was well enough to get back to a full, what I would consider a full life. And even then, very much different. I've never been able to run again, which really makes me sad. But now I
Yeah,
walk, and I'm
yeah.
grateful when I can walk. So you just start to see things differently. And to get back to what is the diagnosis. So 25 years after I first became ill,
Oh,
I was properly diagnosed by a fantastic neurologist in New York, who I still to this day credit with giving me the answers that I so wanted. But I was suffering from a severe case of Lyme disease
mhm.
and other tick-borne, vector-borne infections that had been in my body for 25 years and never treated. And those caused a subsequent chronic autoimmune condition that there is no cure for now. I received treatment for, and probably will for the rest of my life, but the damage was done. Um,
Mm.
so, on the one hand, I had an answer, but here I was faced with the reality of that lack of knowing and not getting a proper diagnosis led to really an invasive chronic illness that I will deal with the rest of my life.
And
Um,
how does Lyme disease impact the body?
so it can impact every aspect of your body. And there's so many misconceptions about Lyme disease. And um, there's another whole piece to this story where I became a caregiver for
Mm.
someone in my family with Lyme disease. So
Oh, hang
fast
on. So the
forward.
both of you have been bitten by ticks.
Yeah, well, here's the interesting thing. I never remember being bitten by a tick,
Oh,
and I never had a bullseye rash.
right.
So, and everyone told me, well, you never saw a tick, you didn't have a bullseye rash, it can't be Lyme disease. Well, that's not true. The science says that's not true now. We know that
Yeah,
today, that
yeah.
more than 50% of people never get a bullseye rash, and you may never see the tick that bites you. But the flu-like symptoms that I had when I was 26 years old, now I know that that was clearly a case of Lyme disease and another infection called babesiosis, which not treated can have severe effects. And that's what it was doing for me. It was giving me brain fog. The fatigue was just beyond anything I had ever experienced. Night sweats, like drenching night sweats, joint pain. I mean, Lyme disease can affect any organ, any symptom. It can affect your vision. And people just don't understand how severe it can be if it's not found and treated early.
And how did it so obviously that sort of ambiguity and obviously the by the sound of it the systemic dismissal from the medical profession. I mean, if the medical profession are dismissing you and telling you it's psychosomatic, how can anybody around you not believe the same? That must be psychologically destructive. How did you work your way through that?
So I call it a cruel twist of fate, actually, because the whole reason I was diagnosed and I was sitting in the office of this brilliant neurologist one day is because
Mm,
my only son, my child, who at the time was 11 years old, became ill almost overnight.
mm,
Um, and he had been a three-sport athlete, very, physically active. And all
yeah.
of a sudden, presented with like flu-like symptoms again in July. And I thought, oh my God, this is like, I felt like I was reliving my life and watching this with my son. And my son had been bitten by a tick and had a bullseye rash when he was 7 years old. I took him right to the pediatrician. He was treated. We thought he was treated adequately, and that was that. But he had a flu-like symptom presentation that then quickly turned into severe neurological symptoms of seizures. And he ended up being in a wheelchair within 4 months. Really, really scary.
Yeah.
So I had said that at 26, that was the worst part of my life. But fast forward and watching your child go through something like this.
Absolutely.
And I thought, oh my God, how is this happening? But what that did is I told myself, I am not going to let him go through what I had gone through, because I had been dismissed by so many medical professionals and really been forced to stop looking for answers for a while, because I was just tired of being told we don't know, or we just can't help you.
Yeah.
And I said, that's not going to happen to him. So I became what I call a mom on a mission. And
Watch out, world.
I took his medical records, and I was a single parent at the time. I took his medical records and laid him out on the floor one night and started to look at, okay, he had this, he was a healthy child. Then he got this tick bite. And then I started to see all these blips like, oh, wait, we went to the pediatrician a lot that year. And then this year and this year. And I started to just use kind of my background in research to see what became so apparent to me, that after his tick bite, he had a series of issues that were unexplained. And so then I started reading everything I could about Lyme disease, talking to people that I could. And one day I found this book called When Your Child Has Lyme Disease, written by a wonderful advocate in the Lyme disease space. And I read the first chapter and I put it down because I thought I was reading my son's story. And I called my dad, who was still very influential in my life. And I said, Dad, I think I know what's wrong, not only with my son, but I think I know what's wrong with me. And he said, what do you mean? And I said, I'm going to read this book tonight and I'm going to bring it to you tomorrow. And that's what I did. I read the book one night. The next morning, I emailed the author. I found an email for her. She was wonderful. She called me. I put my phone number and she called me and she said, Tracy, what can I do? I've been there and it sounds like your son is really in the thick of it. I said, where do I go for help? And she gave me the name of this neurologist in New York who I called. And that was the neurologist that later diagnosed my son. And about a year later, she said to me one day, Tracy, can you come in my office? I want to talk to you about something else. And so my son was having to go to New York like once a month for treatment. So we were there a lot and I got to know her. And she said to me, I know that you have a condition that's not been identified, but I really want to do some testing on you because I've seen you now for the last 6 months. There's definitely something going on. And so sure enough, she tested me and she was the one to properly diagnose me as well.
Wow. And so 25 years.
Yes.
That's hugely. I didn't have the same scenario, but I had a similar scenario back when I was in my early 20s. We were building a house and And I thought it was just, working during the day and building at night on the property and so forth. And my mother was diagnosed with a extremely rare blood disorder. Actually brought about the myth of werewolves and vampires. So technically I'm a vampire, but but yeah, I was diagnosed with that just by chance later on. But when I was, they said, "Oh, you can't possibly have this. Only 3,000 people in the world have this," and blah blah blah. But yeah, it turns out I had the same thing as my mother. So you were diagnosed, thankfully, and then what was it like to have that moment of diagnosis?
I think in the first moment I was angry.
Angry? Why?
I was angry not at because to me it seemed like, why didn't anyone find this? Like, what? This is not a really rare condition. And it just, like, I was upset. And also you have to think that when she diagnosed me, it took us almost 2 years for my son to be properly diagnosed.
Right.
So before we got to her and all of my research and all of that, he had been completely dismissed locally by a host of physicians. And, I live in a very tick endemic area.
Right. Okay.
So, and I would always bring up when they want your history, I'd say, oh, my son had a tick encounter. He had the bullseye rash. He was treated. And nobody ever thought, okay, well, wait a minute. Let's make sure that was all cleared up. And
yeah.
So I was angry. I was angry that for 25 years I had been traumatized by the medical community to think that this was all in my head, when in fact it was doing severe damage to my body all those years. And it was kind of, some things were a little too late for me. Like my neurologist, I love her, and she still says to me she's the most optimistic person. When I say, am I going to have to do this for the rest of my life? And she says, well, I never say never. And we never know what's going to happen. And you have to stay positive, and maybe not, that's the type of conversations we have. But I went from angry to thank you for giving me answers. And I tell her every time I see her that she literally saved my son when nobody else was even looking. And my son just graduated from college. So he was very, very ill for 10 years, but is doing well and working and living a life of a young adult as he should be. But we went through a lot of trauma and a lot of unknown. And I think the pieces that kept coming back to me when I had to put my caregiver hat on with my son was, okay, how did I get through what I went through? And I knew that my parents' support of me was so integral to me keeping my faith and keeping a positive attitude and trying to be grateful for the little things. And so I in turn did the same thing with my son. And I would say, we're going to find out. The next person's going to have the answers. I just never let him stop believing. And I would say to him at the end of every day, what are we thankful for today? He was 10 years old, and all he knew was that his life had come to a stop and he couldn't go to school. And he'd be like, Mom, you're a little, and I'd say, no, like, what's one thing you were thankful for today? And it turned into this thankful game. That really got us through 10 years of very difficult times when I wasn't so sure that things were going to be okay. But I had faith in something, and I just never quit. I never stopped believing, stopped looking for answers. And it really has turned me into a patient advocate today. And I've talked to patients and parents and families all over the world with Lyme disease who went through the same thing I did, who went through the same thing my son did, just to tell them that there's hope and you're not crazy and you just have to get to the right person. There are knowledgeable people out there. And don't listen to the people that tell you Lyme disease is nothing to worry about. It can be something very serious. And I don't know. I think that just over the course of 25 years, my circumstances in my life, I think, led me to a place of just coming into myself. I was always ambitious, type A personality, loved to work, had no problem working 60, 70 hours a week. I just dove into whatever I was doing. But I think when you lose your health, you realize that's the most important thing that you could ever have. And without good health, even if you have a chronic condition, there are good days and there are bad days. I just went through 2 months ago, I went through a severe kind of setback. And I have to say, for 2 weeks, I was not very grateful and I was not very positive. I thought, oh, God, here we are again. But I snap out of it a lot faster now. And I just
And
let myself have those downs.
you've got to have those. I mean,
Yeah.
I call it dynamic harmony. So there's no such thing as balance, especially with chronic conditions, right? So there are times when you go up and there are times when you go down, but ultimately, if you can just keep it in that band, it's not hugely bad and it's not hugely great, and you're just sort of flowing along and you're bumping from edge to edge, But you manage to keep mind, body, and soul in that bandwidth that is manageable, and I think that's very important. So how did you go from, okay, you got diagnosed, then how do you start aligning yourself so that you bring all those things from mind, body, and soul together? Now, you can't bring them together neatly. And segue, you've got a book called My Mess is My Message. So I'm gathering that you did it messily.
Yeah. I mean, I wish, looking back, I had done it a lot differently, but I did it. It took me a lot longer than it takes a lot of people. I really started just with my mental attitude, really how I was thinking about things. And I think that for so long, I had thought that I was going to get this answer. I was going, people that have, and I write about this a lot on my Substack, about invisible illnesses or mysterious illnesses. And I think it's one of the worst places to be because you are questioned by everyone and you don't have the answer. And so you are just longing for that answer. I just want to know what it is. I want to know it has a name. Yeah. Then you get the name and you think, that's it? Great. Now I have a name and there really is no cure. And I just have to live with this now. So I went through a lot of ups and downs of I waited 25 years for this. And the treatment, to be honest, the first few years of treatment, you feel worse than when you started. So I thought, wow, this is great. But I just realized I just had to get to a point of acceptance. It's like the age-old 12-step program, right? Is that I had to accept that this was my life. I don't know why it happened. I don't know why both myself and my son have this illness. I'm grateful that his was caught much sooner than mine, and he was young, and we were able to be aggressive with his treatment. And I'm hopeful that, he will remain in remission. But I think the big switch for me was when I completely accepted this is just how it's going to be. And
Ah,
I can,
bingo. I guarantee Patty's there. One of the people that's watching us right now is a functional health coach, and that acceptance part, you just hit the nail on the head right there. That acceptance part is that first point where you start transitioning from the condition owning you to you owning the condition and being able to do something about it.
yeah. And I think so I worked really hard on that. I mean, I worked with, mental health professionals for a long time, right? Because I needed it. I needed that professional help to just get through a lot of the traumatic things that had happened. And in the meantime, I went through a divorce and being a single parent. I mean, I had a number of things, but I think each one, I used to say, well, what doesn't kill me does make me stronger.
That's right.
And people say that's so cliche. It may be cliche, but it was true for me. I was building this level of resilience through every hardship in my life, where I got to a point that I knew nothing was going to hold me back. If I had been like, there's nothing else that could possibly happen that I can't handle because I've handled so much. And the acceptance then led to, okay, how can I turn this into a positive? And for me, I've always been kind of mission driven. I like to work with, I do pro bono work and work with nonprofits and in my marketing work, because that's just important for me. So I took my life and thought, okay, what is my mission now? Like this, there had to be a reason for me. And how is this going to change my purpose? Because I thought my purpose was to, succeed in my career and have a family and raise my child. And I've done all those things, but that's not my purpose.
No.
My purpose is to help other people that are either going through the darkest times of their life and don't have any support, or are really trying to dig themselves out and just need someone else to say, oh, they were able to do it. And what are some things I can try? Because I didn't have that. I didn't have a cheerleader. I mean, I had my mom and dad, but that was a different that was just a loving support, right?
Yeah, correct.
I didn't have a spouse or a friend saying, maybe look at it this way or try this. I just had to figure it out on my own. And I thought, why isn't there more? Why don't people talk about this? Like people go through hardships all the time and people don't talk about what it was like and how dark it can be. And what are the things that help you move out of it? And I ultimately think if someone says, what's the one thing that saved you? It's gratitude. And it sounds silly. People can say, well, gratitude, but you lost everything. But I found other things to be grateful for. And once you start to be grateful for the sun shining or the fact that you can get out of bed and walk unattended across a room, your life shifts dramatically. And so I'm grateful that I had a lot of people over the years give me different pieces of the puzzle for me. But I think it's different for everyone. That in pulling together the mind, body, spirit, I'll say there are times when the mind and body may be in a better place and the spirit is a little lacking, right? It's hard to keep all three aligned. When I was really sick 2 months ago and my body was not keeping pace, I really had to spend more time on my spiritual and just kind of my mental health to say, okay, you've been through this before, right?
Mm,
Like you can do this, like pep talk.
mm.
How are we going to do this? Meditation, mindfulness, prayer, those are all part of my daily life. And I don't think that I could do what I do today without that.
But I also, from reading your Substack and so on, I've noticed that you also the standard out of the box mindfulness is not how you approach things either. So y- let's talk a little bit about that. How do you approach mindfulness?
So I wrote this article that turned out to be a piece that's resonated with far more people than I ever thought. The title is I Failed at Mindfulness and
Yeah.
what finally worked for me. Because, I grew up at a time when yoga became really popular and meditation became popular. And for me, it didn't it didn't work. I would go to a yoga class and I would feel like not relaxed. I was sitting in a dark room with people chanting or whatever the class may be was
Mm.
more antagonistic to me. It just wasn't my thing. And I would leave and say, well, that was awful. What else am I going to try? And people would say, oh, you didn't try the right class or you didn't have the right instructor. I've tried every kind of yoga that there is. It's not for me. I'm a runner. I like the
Yeah,
runner's high. So I had
yeah.
to try to find something that replicated that. Um, and then I realized that I could be mindful and meditate in so many other ways. It didn't have to be in a yoga room or chanting or whatever someone thinks it may be. It could be journaling.
Mm,
Um, I've been writing and journaling since I was 12 years old. So that was something that was always very peaceful to me. And I was able to get my thoughts on paper and then read them back. And I think you gives you a better perspective sometimes after you kind of sit with something. I realized that taking a walk with my dog uh, was mindful for me. That put
mm.
me in. I don't like to hike because I still have a little PTSD about ticks. Um, so you
As
don't
you
won't
do.
find me in a forest or anything like that. And I make sure that I'm protected. But I love to walk and I love to be in nature. And I live very close to the ocean, so that's very peaceful to me. But that's meditation for me. Sometimes is
Mm,
just to walk down my street to this little sandy beach and sit on the beach, and that's my meditation. And so, what I wanted when I wrote that article, what I wanted people to know is that it doesn't have to be what you think it is. Mindfulness is whatever you find puts you at peace and gives you the opportunity to just take a break from what you're doing and just center yourself in a way that, just brings your nervous system kind of in alignment.
mm.
um, and so those are just some of the basic things. And it's people go, you go for a walk and you write in your journal that's mindfulness. But yeah, it is for me. And it works.
And that's the important thing, that you find your own version of what works for you, whether it's mindfulness, whether it's spirituality, or exercise like the asanas of yoga. Now,
Right.
there's something else I'd like to ask you about, which I know nothing about. Marjorie Pizzoli says hi, but she also says that your toolbox has helped her. What's your toolbox?
Oh, and so I don't have my glasses on right now, so I'm not seeing anything in the
No, that's
chat.
all right. That's all right. I'm doing the
So hi,
translation for you.
Marjorie. Marjorie's a dear friend. So my toolbox is something, I guess, that, as a as a writer and in my marketing career, I always had to kind of take complex issues and break them down into simple to understand. And so when I started to, and I think one of the things, Paul, that might be helpful to say, because people may wonder this, is why after so many years did I decide to start writing and start talking about all of these things in my life? Because as I said early on, I was ashamed that I had gotten ill and lost my job. For a long time, I carried that as if it was for me. But my dad, who passed about 4.5 years ago, he and I were very, very close. And um, before he passed away, he said to me, "You have learned so much about life, about obviously about Lyme, about illness, about resilience, but you don't talk about it and you keep everything to yourself. And I really think you're doing yourself a disservice." He said, "You have a gift of words. And can you promise me that you will write? You don't have to share it with anyone, but just write what you know. And I think that ultimately you will share it with people because you could help even one person." And I think he realized the ills in the medical community and he became really kind of, I don't know, upset with a lot of the treatment that both my son and I had received. And he said, you don't have to do it in an antagonistic way, but you do need to kind of correct the record, if you will, and let people know that are suffering that maybe there's something more that they need to look at, right? That their doctors are missing. And you wanted to give up, and you did give up many times, but I'm asking you to please, for me, do this. And my dad passed away shortly after that conversation. And I felt like he had been ill and he knew he knew he had to deliver that message while he could. I didn't realize that he was not going to be with me that much longer, but I really took that to heart. And I was in a writer's group and I said, "I think I want to write a book about my story." And I met Marjorie in that writer's group, and I met some wonderful people there who really started to encourage me to write. But when I started to write, I realized that the story had not fully unfolded because my son at the time was still really ill, and I couldn't distance myself from it enough to write the book. But I said, well, maybe I can write it in some other way. And someone in the writers group said, "I'm going to challenge you. Have you ever heard of this thing called Substack?" I didn't know what Substack was. This was 4 years ago. And I'm going to challenge you because I know you can do it as a marketing person too, over the weekend for you to start a Substack and post the first article. And I was like, what? Okay. And I got off the call and I said, let me go check it out. And that's how I came to start my Substack. It was really my dad pushing me and this group of wonderful people that I had met saying, okay, forget the book right now if you can't write the book, but you can write an article and just get it out there. And then I think I hit publish and I was like, oh my God, what did I just do? It's like out there now, but it was very cathartic. And I realized there's a place for this. So long story about the toolkit is that I decided to say, because people said to me, well, what were all the things that combined? Like you said, what was it that got you through? And it was a combination of just building that resilience, perseverance of not wanting to say, I'm not going to find the answer. I just never gave up. um, remaining faithful in something, even if my faith definitely waned at times, finding that mindfulness, learning that mindfulness and meditation don't have to be a formal program or lesson that you have to learn and succeed at. I was kind of done with the succeeding. I was just
Mm.
like, no, I want to live. I want to be joyful in whatever my day looks like, and I want to thrive. I don't want to succeed. Yes, it would be nice to succeed in some ways, but I felt like I was done with that. So my toolkit is all of those things together. It's not just one, it's about 10 different tools
Mm.
that I realized when I broke it down, I, I needed all of them. I couldn't do it without all of them. And I just kept adding different pieces to it. Like it started with gratitude, but then it just built from there.
So you really, again, like I could just sit back and it sounds like you're reading from my own book, Decode Your Diagnosis, because you talked about resilience before. I have in there the rings of resilience, and the one that I really like just now, going from succeeding to thriving, because most people think, and just like I've grown up in the right place, I've had the great career, been a CEO, all those sort of things. But it wasn't until I had to toss all that in the bin with severe heart disease that I suddenly started to thrive. How does a person shift from purely trying to survive, and I'll call aiming for success survival, because you're scrambling up that Maslow's hierarchy of needs, trying to get to the top of the pile of
Yeah.
success with all the widgets and chattels and all the stuff. But then it's you fall off of that and you suddenly find that there's a whole different thing. How do you actively use a diagnosis and that mind shift as a launch pad to go to a deeper purpose? How would somebody else do that? I mean, you've done it, I've done it, but how would the average person do that?
I think that you have to start wherever you are, right?
Mm.
And everybody's in a different place. Some people may never have faith in anything. I was fortunate that I grew up Catholic and I went to church every week and I taught CCD when I was younger. That was something
Sorry,
that
what's
anchored
CCD?
me. I'm
What's
sorry.
CCD? What's
Oh,
CCD?
so teaching Catholicism to young students as
Yep.
they're
Okay.
learning. So, I had a deep faith that anchored me as a child. But when I get sick, I kind of lost that faith a little bit. I was just angry
Mm.
for a while, which I think is natural. But then I realized, no, there's a reason. And what I came to believe is that, this is what really kept me going for almost every day of my son's illness for 10 years.
Mm.
I said to myself, I may never know the reason why this happened, but I want him to look back on every day and say, my mom made this the best day it could be.
Ah.
And we literally were just surviving every day. But I realized that by taking that pressure off of, like, why is this happening? What's the reason? What is this supposed to be teaching me? I just let it all go and said,
Mm.
I don't know. I may never know, but that's okay as long as I enjoy this moment today. And at the time my son was ill and then my dad got ill. And so here I was watching two of the people that I love the most in my life really, really struggle.
Mm.
And I thought, the only thing that matters to me is spending time with them and that I be present when I'm there. And so if that meant playing 20 hands of gin rummy with my son to keep him occupied and happy during a day, that's what I was going to do. Whatever it was to be present in the lives of the people that I loved. And I think that a lot of times we get so caught up in our lives in the daily things that we have to do that we forget to be present. And that means putting your phone down or shutting it off or just sitting down and having a conversation. Sometimes you don't even have to have a conversation. Sometimes I would say I remember when my son was in a wheelchair and he was so embarrassed to leave the house. And I would say to him, "Oh, but we have to walk the dog." "No, I can't walk the dog." I said, "You can walk the dog." I would push him and he would hold the leash. And he didn't want to go outside because he was embarrassed that he was in a wheelchair. But I positioned it in that, our dog needed him to do that and we were going to make it fun. And he would do it and begrudgingly at first. And then, he'd say, "Oh, this is kind of fun," right? It's just changing the perspective a little bit and just trying to get people to look at things in a different way sometimes.
Patty was just saying what an incredible act of faith and resilience you have, Tracy.
Thank you.
And that is incredible because I suppose the question that comes to mind then is, how do you perceive the relationship between suffering and spiritual clarity yourself as a strong Catholic?
I don't know that I have the answer to that, to be honest. And interestingly, during COVID, because I was immune compromised, my son was immune compromised, and my dad was immune compromised. We stopped going to church.
Right.
Out of necessity because we couldn't take the chance. And I will be honest that I don't formally go to church anymore, but I still have a very strong faith. I think that there was a time when I was suffering or other people around me were suffering that being in a formal setting of church was not a positive for me. I was finding myself questioning a lot. And when I found myself questioning, it started to affect my spirituality, if that makes sense. And I thought, okay, so I can force myself to go sit in this building and do what I think is right, but it's not peaceful and I'm going to question everything about it. Or I can find a different way for me to be spiritually healthy. And so that is what I have found, is that through suffering, sometimes everything shifts and you don't necessarily know where you're going to land. But if you can land in a place that is peaceful for you, that helps you look at every day as an opportunity, even if it's not the opportunity you thought. And I don't like to sugarcoat any chronic illness because I will gladly and openly say that there are days when I don't look like this, right? There's no makeup. I'm not in regular clothes. I have to cancel a meeting. I can't go to work. I'm sick and I can't leave my house. But those days don't affect me like they used to anymore. I just say, okay, it's one of those days, right? So what can I do when I'm home? When I'm like that, I can read. I love to read and I don't have enough time to read. Sometimes I just give into it. And I think that when you're constantly fighting the chronic piece of it, it can really bring you down. And so I think what I've mastered is the day by day, and let's thrive for today.
That's absolutely perfect way to close out our session. But before we go, I'd like to ask you if you had the chance and go back to that girl at 26, what's one thing you would say to her back then about the life that you've had so far and where it's going and how she should possibly think about it?
Oh God, I would have just said, just relax, just like give yourself a break. I was so hard on myself. I was very driven and just couldn't accept that there was some other life. I just thought this is my path. I'm supposed to do X. And what I've learned is that we don't know what we're supposed to do. I think we're all on our own journey. And every journey is different. And you just have to be open and not put so much pressure on yourself. I think I wasted a lot of time worrying about things that didn't matter.
Oh, that inner critic. Oof.
Yeah. And even today, I still, I still see little glimpses of that 26-year-old where I think, oh, I could have done that so much better. Or, when I've taken several breaks from Substack out of necessity for my health. And then I feel guilty about it. And I'm like, oh, I can't, it's okay. It's okay.
Yeah.
People will understand.
Yeah,
So just give yourself a break.
You do. You have to give yourself a break. And with that, Tracy, it's time for us to take a break. And thank you so much for being a guest on Sessions from the Edge. I literally, every time I have one of these conversations, I'm taken to a whole new level. And I haven't stopped smiling the whole time. Because everything I'm hearing.
It's a pleasure to be here. And I hope that something resonates with one person. Really, that's always my goal, is that anything I write, anything that I say,
resonated with everybody.
I need to put my glasses on and see.
Well, see, Marjorie's here saying thank you so much for a great live stream.
And Patty, hi Patty,
Patty,
and
an incredible
Marjorie.
act of faith and resilience.
Oh, it's just so nice to see the names and the people here, and I just
Sune, one of the greats of Substack and being able to transform it into an income and so on. I mean, it's just lovely. Jennifer Mackey here, one of my long-term people I follow. So lovely. Well, thank you everybody on the other side of this camera, and thank you, Tracy. It's been a wonderful session. This will come back in a couple of weeks as well and feature for a whole week. So thank you, everybody, and we'll talk to you again soon.
All right. You take care.
Thanks, everybody. See ya.